Hi, my name is Barbara John, and I'm a producer here at New TV. And I'm here today to interview a very, very interesting person, Claire Kastner. And Claire is interesting for a very specific reason. She was one of the people who went to the South during the Civil Rights era to try to create a fairer society. And she really did put her life on the line, as all the other civil rights workers did, to improve the possibility of voting rights for black people in the South. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Claire Kastner. Hi Claire, I'd like to welcome you here to New TV today to do an interview about your very interesting service for civil rights. And in 1965, as I understand it, you went down to Alabama to help in registering voters. And
Yes.
as we know, that was an extraordinary part of American history, and you were part of it. So I'm going to ask you a few questions today.
Sure.
I think the first one you can answer very easily. Where were you born?
In Boston.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in, my whole life, I lived in Wayland, Massachusetts.
When you went down south as a civil rights worker, you were in college. And what college was that?
I was at Brown University, and it was a program organized through the college. It was just, we graduated that summer.
Oh, you graduated and then you went
And then
down.
this was our graduation present. I do sort of remember thinking to myself, well, 50 years from now, do I want to be able to say, yes, I rose to that challenge and went? I will say I did have my very good friend had gone to Mississippi the summer before, and she also brought back a lot of that energy. But the civil rights activity that around which this project developed was really inspired, I think, initially by the Episcopal chaplain who was at Brown. His name was John Crocker. And when we arrived at Brown as freshmen, we discovered that I was not an Episcopalian, but my very good friend was. We discovered that he was not at the chaplain tea because he was in jail in Alabama, having been one of the Freedom Riders.
The summer before you went, the 3 civil rights workers were murdered, and that became a big cause célèbre, in particularly among students and activists and people of goodwill. But you went anyway.
Certainly that affected us, and those of us who made the decision to go. It affected us in a way of sort of making it very clear that this was not just a frivolous trip, that it had its risks. Let's again bring white students down. National press will pay attention, and consequently those courthouses that have been reluctant to adhere to the law, or who have intimidated people who would like to come to register, knowing that there's the focus of national attention, will hopefully pressure those people to adhere to the law.
Could you talk about the law and what kind of impediments were put up to prevent people from voting?
One of the difficulties, and I certainly don't know all of the ins and outs of it, but in particularly in the county that I was working at, which was Choctaw County, people were allowed to come to register to vote. Black people were allowed to come to register to vote. However, the days that the registrar was available was always sort of shifting. It was never clear what day somebody would be there. So that was one sort of roadblock. You wouldn't really know what day you were supposed to get there. Then once you got up to register to vote, there had been a poll tax. The poll tax had been eliminated, but you were asked to fill out 3 sections of a form. And one of those sections included reading a random sentence from the Alabama Constitution, and then interpreting that sentence to the registrar in the way that they felt it was appropriate to be interpreted. So you can imagine that nobody was going to pass that. And just before we arrived in Alabama, there was a federal court injunction that ordered the registrar at the courthouse to open the courthouse for the registrar's office for 1 week a month, to register as many as 100 people if that many people showed up, and to eliminate this 3rd section where the requirement for interpretation of the Alabama Constitution was being asked. You felt that if we were not there, the idea, for instance, of opening the courthouse 1 week a month might have gotten postponed, or, oh, we've changed it. Or there were so many ways that if you wished to subvert the law, you could. People felt that if you stood up and said, I'm going to go register, you might lose your job, you might be intimidated by the police. And we certainly did get a feeling that the police were an intimidating force.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out is just being white, or being white from the North, or being white with access to reporters. What were the factors?
I think the factors were, just being white in the South was, there was really almost total segregation of the communities. I mean, we lived in the black community. We never, with the exception of one white couple that came to visit us from another part of Alabama, there was no white person in the town that was anything other than hostile, or at least appeared to be hostile towards the black community or to us participating in the black community. So whiteness in this sense was that the national press would notice, and the FBI would notice, that there were white young people down in this volatile part of the country where 2 white people had been killed this summer before. And consequently, it was sort of, people better behave. The law enforcement people should enforce the laws that they are required to enforce.
How did the white people in the town, or those people, show hostility towards you? How did you feel when you were there?
They would in some cases, harass us and say racial slur kinds of things. By and large, they essentially just walked on the other side of the street. We seldom went into the white part of town, but if we did, people would turn away.
They knew who you were.
Oh, it became very clear that they knew who we were. The clearest example of sort of, I would say, intimidation was from the police. There is a law, I think in all states, that say if you reside in a state for more than 6 weeks, you need to have a driver's license from that state. So they took away our driver's licenses after they knew clearly when we got to the town, because in fact there had been a drive around the house we were staying in with cars with the lighted crosses on their car, driving around and around and around. This was primarily, they had electric crosses on their cars, and it was sort of the Ku Klux Klan, or an offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. It was definitely a reference to the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
And what was a little disturbing was that the sheriff was right there in amongst the drivers.
Were there a lot of drivers driving around?
I would say maybe 20. There were
20
enough that
different
it was
cars?
scary.
20 different cars?
It,
Yeah.
it was scary enough.
That's
But-
extremely
so
scary.
we realized that they knew we were there, and they weren't terribly happy that we were there. What became clear was that in many cases, the volunteers were protected at nighttime by members of the black community who would stand guard at the houses that they stayed in with guns, because the people within the black community knew that this whole situation was not terribly safe. So they took our driver's licenses away, and then we went to apply for a new one. We said, okay, we'll get Alabama license plates and driver's licenses. So I think I was the first one to go, and I asked for the book to read the rules, and they said, oh, you don't need a book. We'll take you for a driver's test. And so I said, I remembered, when I'd gotten my driver's license here, that you have somebody go with you. And so I said, my friend will come with me. And they said, oh, no, no, you'll come just with the state trooper, or the police. Not the state trooper, the Alabama police. Choctaw County police. So I got in the car with this policeman.
Were you scared?
I was very scared because, there was in my mind the people who'd been killed the year before. They were taken off somewhere and beaten and whatever. And I thought, well, let's hope that won't happen. So I will say it was terrifying, but because not only did we drive, we drove way out in the country. He said, turn left and then turn down this dirt road and keep on driving, and I thought I may not come back. But he then said, pull over, and I thought that may be the end of it, and he then said, execute an Alabama U-turn, and I said, well, I'm not quite sure what an Alabama U-turn is, and he said, well, you should. And I didn't want to argue about the fact that I had asked for a book and I didn't get a book. But anyway, so I think I did a U-turn, and that wasn't an Alabama U-turn. I think it may turn out it was a 3-point turn or whatever it was. But all of that time I kept thinking to myself, how do I make sure that I don't antagonize this guy in any way? And in fact, I never did pass the driver's license test.
That was like getting...
But I did survive. I grew up in a suburb outside of Boston. It was not a dangerous place at all, and the policemen are your friends there. This made me fully understand, as much as I can fully understand, what it must feel like to be in a situation where police are seen as a threat, not as a support. It's not even what somebody does, it's the fact that history suggests that the encounter may be dangerous.
I'd like to get a feel of where you lived and what you did when you were there.
Well, initially, we were going to live in a house that was vacant at the moment, or at least the young men were going to live in the house, and we were going to live with some community people. because of the Klan coming and driving around the house, the community decided it wasn't safe for us to be in the house by ourselves. So we all lived with members of the black community who were willing to have us live there. It was threatening. It was dangerous for them to have us in their houses. And so not everybody was particularly willing to, to offer us lodging. I happened to stay with one of the other volunteers at the home of Reverend Spears and his wife. They were a sort of prominent members of the community. What we did was primarily go out into the black community, which was it was very rural community. So you would find a house here and then a house there and a house there, to let people know that this court injunction that I had mentioned before, that was easing up on the restrictions for the voter registration, that injunction had been passed, and that there was a week, the beginning of July, was going to be a time for registration, and that we wanted to encourage people to come and register. So we would go to people's houses, and then we would have...
You had a car?
We
you had
did have
access to a car?
these were our cars that we then didn't have driver's licenses for. But in the beginning, we had driver's licenses, and we were able to drive around.
And just to black people's houses?
Only to black people's houses. Now, we had one, there were 8 of us, 7 white people and 1 black young man from Providence. And that determined how we were going to configure our driving around, because it became very clear the rule was you would never have a white woman drive in the car with a black man. This was much too dangerous for anybody, but particularly for the black person. We also we made a little office, and we were printing up flyers about advertising about the when the courthouse was going to be open for registration, because the courthouse was not close by. It was I think maybe 45-minute drive, so it wasn't easy for people to get there. And so there was some organizational activities within the community how to get people to the courthouse. It wasn't terribly efficient to go and meet people at their houses, but it certainly was important for us, sort of, I think, to be understood, and for us to understand something about the community, that we would go to people's houses.
How did black people relate to you? You mentioned it as you went out to, and people said, you just don't know.
Some people had probably never, I mean, the most amazing thing was this was a very poor community. Mm-hmm. And some of the people that we would go and see, as I say, lived, let's say, 15 miles out, and it lived in very, very poor circumstances. And they would provide a dinner for us that was, it seemed so incredibly generous and wonderful and delicious. And they were very gracious, but it was very much as though you were sure that they had probably never had white people in their house at all. None of the family would sit down with us. They would basically sit us at the table, and then they would bring us food and serve us, and we would say, let's all sit down together. And that didn't happen. We were treated very much as sort of exotic visitors. In some cases, I'm sure people were happy to have us be there. I'm sure some people, even though they may have welcomed us there, were also mindful of the fact that it was dangerous for them. if we worried about our safety, the individuals who stood up and said, yes, I'm going to be part of this forward movement, they were risking much more than we were risking, because we would be going home. And, as I'd said before, we had the spotlight. They knew, the national news is going to pay attention if one of us disappears. If one of those people who lived 15 miles out in the valley, if one of their kids disappeared, that wasn't necessarily going to make the news. Or if their car got smashed up, or if their house got burned down, or if the church got burned down. That wasn't going to make the news the way. And again, this was a tiny little town. It was, I think, of the old, how people would refer to southern towns, it would be the quarter, which was the black quarter. That's where people lived. If you needed to come and buy something, you bought it from the white store owner. And that person could control whether or not, what your credit looked like, whether you could buy things. I mean, it was a very, it was not a freestanding black community with all the resources. But we would also have meetings at churches, and some churches felt that we were welcome or welcomed us, and some felt it was too dangerous to welcome us, and they were not interested in having us come. But we would have what we would call mass meetings at these churches, and some of them would have 50 people, and some of them would have 20 people. There was a great deal of fear in the community, especially for the people who were not already involved. There was this Choctaw Civic Association, and those people were there were the teachers in the school, and the people who were already more active in the community. The people who lived out in the country were much more vulnerable, and saw themselves as more vulnerable. Lynchings were not that far in the past. I mean, we didn't know anything about things like lynchings, but certainly for people growing up in that community, they were a very real part of history. So for us to come and say, oh, sure, the federal government says it's okay to come and register, come on down, people would kind of look at us and say, I mean, they would never say this to us, but you got the sense that they were saying, you don't know what the world is like here. We didn't know the consequences of some of the things that we were doing.
So you were generally very guided by
I think
the
so.
leaders.
I think we tried very hard because, we were young, we were college educated, we were all excited, we thought we were going to change the world, and to realize that maybe we didn't know everything, and maybe there were people who could help us learn here. And we're not so sure we want to do it. So there was a lot of reluctance in the beginning. So the group meetings were kind of provided an opportunity to have some peer pressure from other members of the community saying, I'm going, come with me, we'll go together. And I think the first time the courthouse was open, we managed to have 75 people come and line up to vote. And then, of course, the registrars were very slow, so maybe they registered 10 people that day, and here these people had made this huge effort to get there, and they weren't able to register. And that kind of thing kept on going. But I think by the end, I think we registered maybe 700 or 800 people. So it was, from our point of view, and I think from the Civic Association's point of view, it was a successful event, a successful project. The voting rights bill, which had been submitted in the spring, was eventually passed in August, and that would make a huge impact in later years, so that if you look at the demographic of the elected officials before the voting rights bill and say 4 or 5 years after the voting rights bill, it is a remarkable change. The presence there up until then, there were essentially no black officials in any small towns anywhere in the Deep South, Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. And now there are many.
This has been a very, very interesting interview, and I think your insights are invaluable. And I thank you so much for coming.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.